Thank you everyone for joining again today. My name is Taylor Zork, and we're here for another Water Cooler Wednesday. Today's discussion is a continuation of a previous discussion we had with Carrie Sechel here. Please, if I'm butchering your last name, I'm sorry there, Carrie. You can correct me when when I'm done. But I think that ultimately it's going to be a really interesting thing because we were able to only get through a certain amount. She had a lot to talk about, and I think it was really crucial stuff for understanding what our role is in this kind of evolving industry and how we can go beyond what traditional finance expects of us and leverage forward looking tools and leverage tools that are just kind of emerging right now to be able to improve not only forecasting but our understanding of how those forecasts need to change and how we need to be agile in this new industry. So thank you, Carrie, again for joining us. And if I butchered your last name, please correct me or whatever.
No, no, it's perfectly fine. It is pronounced Sechel, but
Sechel. Okay, perfect.
it's off. But most people think it's Seychelles. So you got it right, Taylor. So it's
My
fine.
my wife is from Quebec, so I always try to throw in a little bit of a French accent. I just there is a place it's called the Seychelles that is spelt very differently. So I think that's where my
Yes,
mind got stuck. So cool. So yeah, so I think that I forget exactly where we left off, but if maybe you could kind of run us through just like a quick recap of some of the stuff we talked about last time. I don't know if you have that stuff on
sure.
hand. But yeah, if you could just begin with that, and then we can kind of move on through some of the other topics we discussed, and also come kind of the things we were talking about before the call started. We can dive into that stuff as well.
Super. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Perfect. One
Um,
moment.
yeah, if you guys could
Uh,
just
there we go. All set.
cool. Let me go ahead and share. And this was just when it pops up. This was just these are the key points. And on the last call, we made it through the first four. So we got up to building the forecast and we're at a stopping point. And I don't think we need to dive back into those other points because they're just we could end up down the rabbit hole. But for anybody who's listening, I think the key here is that there are a lot of principles from regular, other companies and other industries that you may have used in forecasting that are going to be applicable here, but there are a lot of other considerations to be aware of, and which actually makes this really exciting because I think we have a great ability to be both creative and to add a lot of value to clients and organizations that we're working with. But in this call, we were going to talk about actually building the forecast, using the forecast numbers, and updating and evolving the forecast. Now, Taylor and I were having a chat before this because we've been reflecting on this, I'd say, challenge that continues to come up with CFOs and finance accounting people in this ecosystem, which is communicating the data, communicating process and procedures, all these sorts of things to super excited founders and other people on the management team who are, gung ho, out there creating, but sometimes we have to maybe rein it back in. Sometimes we have to be the bearers of the news of this is what the data is telling us, and sometimes we need to set parameters that may seem a little limiting at first, but they're actually focused on the long-term goal. And Taylor, do you think it makes sense now to just chat a little bit about that nuance between modeling and forecasting?
Yeah, and I think I have a kind of cool example to illustrate this a little bit. We when I was working at Trust Swap, we had this new business line that we were planning on rolling out called Mint, and it actually still exists. And part of the business model was, you can mint for just the gas fees, but we're going to take like 1% of the total supply of whatever you mint. And the thought process was, if people are minting all these coins, there's going to be times where like a meme coin hits and it just becomes this massive thing, and then that's where we're going to collect our revenue. And so it created these extremely like optimistic models that made it look like, you know, and it assumed that a lot, that we were going to get all these great projects, and then we were going to have all these tokens, and then it didn't work out, that it ended up being really a revenue driver at all, and it was partially because, who's tracking all of these potentially valuable tokens that were minted on our platform? How are we claiming them? How are we determining which ones are going to be recognizable as revenue and which ones are just going to be dust and, like BS? But it kind of went from this extremely optimistic thing to, now you got to adjust it and come back to reality. And I think that the thing that we were discussing before was like, those initial models with, very nascent companies that are just starting, that may be extremely optimistic, that don't really jive with forecasting moving forward. And yeah, if you want to just elaborate on that a little bit, Carrie.
Yeah, yeah. I think that this is a really important nuance for anybody working in this area and also with any other startups because, if you were to go into a company that had been around for 15, 20 years, the company has massive amounts of historical data. And the owners have also been through multiple cycles with that data. When we're dealing with startups, it's all new. And that's why collecting whatever real data is available at the earliest moment possible that can help to inform whether or not those models are shaping up is really critical. And I think, Brandon made some really good points. Keeps talking about, educating the non-finance people. And I think that's really, really important. And I think this difference between the original model that was this blue sky, wonderful, amazing idea, and then when the data starts to come in and building a forecast and it just continuing to educate between that model and the forecast and the importance of that forecast. And hey, sometimes the numbers can come out even better. They
Hmm.
don't have to be worse.
Hmm.
They also could be different. So also educating, the data may even tell us things that we weren't even thinking about.
Hmm.
It can be opportunities, whatever they are. It all is informing as to this like living, breathing thing that's being birthed and created, and using whatever live data you have as quickly as you can that's reasonable, and making sure that the model doesn't just become the forecast
Yeah.
and the budget is really critical.
Yeah, I think that to adding on to this point, one of the things that we noticed when we were offering like our smart contract locks, which was essentially like these audited smart contracts that new projects could use to lock up team tokens and have them vest over time, or lock up the liquidity tokens and have those vest, or have those kind of just like locked up for, let's say 2 years or something like that, so that folks who are looking to buy on a DEX have the um, I guess, confidence that you're not going to dump on them, right away, or that the team's not just going to dump their tokens. They're going to actually have to vest into them. So, but we noticed that when we started to, we were kind of like lagging behind some of our competitors after a little while, and our competitors were just, the only reason why we were lagging behind them was because they were charging more, and it just, even though it's the exact same product, it's the exact same function, we noticed that if we raised our prices, we appeared to be the premium option, and the actual demand went up. So you can note when you are agile in this forecasting, you can test out these things like, okay, let's, for the next, let's just increase our prices for the next month, and we'll advertise that they've gone up, and see what happens, and then you can kind of make adjustments there. And I think that it's about being agile, but it's also about, like you're saying, using the data that's abundant in this industry. We've never had an industry where the data was as continuous and as abundant. So use that to your advantage, and see, you can play around with the different metrics, but it's important to know what metrics you're tracking, because if you're not, um, capturing value in a way, and you kind of have this blue sky view, like you alluded to, where okay, great, we're going to capture a 1% of the token supply. Well, if we were to just charge a fee for this instead, you know, we know we're gonna have a more consistent, cash flow. And so I kind of got a little bit on a tangent there, but I think it's important to understand that like the data is abundant, and so you need to be agile if you want to be as successful as possible, because there's a lot of things you can play around with and a lot of levers you can pull in this industry.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Um, Taylor, I think I'm gonna go to the slide now about building the forecast and
Perfect.
dive into that. This is an
And
area, so I'm just gonna,
just real quick, for anyone who
yeah.
missed the previous call, we record all these calls. So if you're curious about what we talked about the last time, I'm not sure if it's uploaded yet, but it should be uploaded in the next like week or so. Brandon, correct me if I'm wrong. But we have the part one of this call. So if you're curious about what we talked about in the initial sections of this, you can jump back on that and watch that at your own leisure. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, no, no problem. So building the forecast, and this is where I'm gonna put this out there. The first point I have on here is tools. And I've been doing accounting, tax, finance, modeling, forecasting for 25 years. And I will say that I'm a little stuck in the love for Excel camp. So I'm going to put that out there. Anybody who has any tools, and I've done a little bit of, I poke around with people and I ask, hey, do you use other things? And I it's really interesting because other than, when you get into like some really advanced stuff that really goes beyond actually what accountants and finance people are probably doing, it more is in the, token engineering space and in like really, different types of mechanisms you're trying to put together. Excel seems to continue to be a really solid tool, particularly when, and I think this is the case in the crypto industry, there's just so many different variables that we have to account for, and businesses and business models are so different, and the different types of metrics that we're trying to forecast are, they're new in a lot of ways. I mean, there's still the old tried and true, you got to know if you've got revenue and you have to know what your profit is. I
Mhm.
mean, those are really, really important, in cash. But then there's all these other items that we can be forecasting for that move those different levers. And Excel continues to be, and Taylor, I'm really interested if you have any other tools that you use, but I think Excel continues to be the leader in the clubhouse.
Yeah, I mean, when I was more active as a CFO in the space, I there was some tools, I forget the name of them, but they were like really great. They would help you create really great visuals and graphs, because I'm less kind of skilled at doing those types of graphs and like modeling in Excel. But it was like I was on a trial version, and the software was like $30,000 a year. So like we ended up I leveraged a couple of different free versions of it, and it was great, but it was just like beyond what I was willing to spend, in order to get what it was giving me. But yeah, I mean, the challenge is when you get into like really, really deep data sets. Like I know that there's, companies out there like Hedera that produce, billions of transactions a year. And so that can get a little bit cumbersome in Excel. But if you're a like an early stage startup that has a few different company wallets, and you're able to track those, I think that Excel is it's a Swiss Army knife. You can kind of do with it what you want, and I think that's the draw of it. Novez, Christians on the call, they provide really clean data for like viewing specific transactions on chain and downloading like a group of transactions from like wallet history and things like that. They have a really good way to kind of uh, inject into that more human readable content. So like they've analyzed things on the blockchain to be able to say like, okay, this we know that this was a smart contract that issued that interacts with liquidity pools, so it's a swap, and they provide data that's a little bit more clean. So if you can leverage Excel with some of these other tools that augment the data to help you process it more easily, that can be a really nice way to kind of combine different aspects of the industry as well.
Yeah, that's an awesome point because Excel is, I think, kind of like the top layer. And with everything else there in this industry, there's just so much data.
Hmm.
And so that's a really excellent point of Excel can kind of be like the collector
Hmm.
area where you're presenting and creating things, creating tables and different types of calculations for communication. But some of these other tools are essential to get the raw data into something that's usable.
And I mean, there's also, I mean, of course, you can't like forget about subledgers too. I mean, like,
Yeah.
Cryptio, Bitwave, Integral, Legible, all those companies have really good products that allow you to digest the data and give it in a more tradfi kind of presentation. But to your point, like if you're looking at growth in wallet addresses that hold your token, or you're looking at, transactions on chain over time, like you can pump that stuff into Excel and do some really sophisticated modeling on trend lines like that. So it all depends on the KPIs that you're looking to that are important to you. And as we've talked about throughout this discussion, those KPIs can change and should be looked at and scrutinized constantly.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And along with the tools is the time frame for the forecast. I think that it's really, when we think about forecasting, what we're trying to do is use the data that we have to understand where the most probable outcomes are going to be in the future. And then how do we manage the business accordingly? What types of decisions do we make? How does that impact operations? And and strategic decisions. And so understanding the time frame and also thinking through what's even realistic. Uh, this is where I think it's another education piece in this particular industry. And I think also just with startups in general is, okay, we've got, 6 months of data. Forecasting 20 years is probably, there's probably less and less likelihood of being able to assign a really realistic probability the farther out that goes. Whereas
Hmm.
if you have a business that's been around for 50 years, forecasting out 20 years, it still, has a lot of potential error, but there's more historical data to help inform that.
Hmm.
Um, so understanding the time frame and also what time frame is realistic, and talking with the business people who are using the forecast in other ways to say, understanding probability, probability of knowing, using 6 months worth of data to know what's going to happen 5 years from now, it starts to degrade and degrade. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but just thinking through that, how probable is this forecast, and making sure that people wrap their heads around that instead of being like, okay, well, this is what's going to happen. Because I think,
Hmm.
especially when a forecast looks really good, people are like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. And it's like, okay, well, this is a forecast. So I think that's really important. And it goes also along with the two inputs, which are quantitative and qualitative data. So um, understanding all this historical data that's quantitative that we can pull from the subledgers, that we can pull from the exchanges, that we can pull from the different wallets, that we can pull from all over these different sources to try to get to different KPIs and to different levers in the business. That quantitative data is super, super important. There's also qualitative data that can be really important if used consistently and with rigor. But market forecasts. I mean, in forecasting, it's not. I think it's actually really prudent to have scenarios.
Hmm.
And I don't think it would be odd at all for a crypto company right now to have a forecast for two different scenarios of what may happen with the US election,
Hmm.
especially for a crypto business that is in North America and is highly sensitive to the regulatory environment here. And that would go towards, I could say that I'm in North America, so that's what I'm more familiar with, but that could be in different areas of the world.
Hmm.
That is a known known. We understand that that could be a highly volatile event, and the different scenarios could be very different. And for some businesses, that could be those two scenarios could inform very different action sets. So using that quantitative data, and I think it's great to use qualitative data for scenarios to say, okay, well, this is a known known. We don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we know that this election is going to happen,
Hmm.
and we know that it's reasonable to believe that depending on the outcome, the forecast could change. So then having scenarios and being able to help the business prepare to respond
Hmm.
and to be positioned to continue on based on either scenario.
So, following that kind of thought process, how important do you think it is for, Web3 businesses, let's say specifically Web3 companies with their own token, to be forecasting and thinking around market cycles as well? Because I know that, you know, you can have, if things are trending in a really awesome direction, but it's because you're in the beginning phases of a bull run, those forecasts can get really optimistic because you can say, okay, let's compound this growth by 5 or 10% a year or whatever you say, you know, that can be great to say. But if you don't kind of pay attention to the market cycles and think about where you are in that cycle, those can get overly optimistic and you could maybe miss out on the opportunity to take either profits and move, kind of de-risk into stables or whatever. How important do you think it is for CFOs to be following market cycles as well?
I think it's critically important, especially in crypto. And, you know, and particularly when you're thinking about, like, if we're thinking about businesses that hold, a lot of crypto on balance sheet, and they're watching prices to inform whether or not they're going to raise, stable coins or fiat currency to pay operational bills, that is, people have all sorts of different risk tolerances to that, and especially in this industry. And it is critically important to scenario plan around, okay, we're at a bull cycle. So what's the most optimistic scenario? And you may even say that's the most probable scenario.
Hmm.
It's also another, likely scenario. Maybe it's that the bull run is fine, but it kind of falls flat from an expectation standpoint and it doesn't go nearly as high as everybody thinks. And then there's the black swan.
Hmm.
Like, okay, something happens. Nobody saw that coming. But being able to understand what having a scenario for that black swan, and knowing that even if that happened, the business could stay alive, that is critical. And another thing that I think is really tricky in a bull cycle is that in a bull cycle, the market will pull back.
Hmm.
And,
So, not getting
so
spooked by that too, right?
and it can pull back at really crappy times. Like,
Hmm.
think about, we're a lot of people who are here and who are listening do a lot of tax work. So what if a client is going to have a huge tax bill, and that's when and they are gonna, planning on, they're like, oh, well, we're in a bull cycle. I want to keep those, keep those tokens, and I don't want to raise cash until I have to because price is going up. And then it pulls back the week that the taxes have to get raised, and that makes paying the tax feel even worse.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really having that foresight of not only like, okay, whatever our forecasts are saying, how long we think this bull cycle is going to last, but also planning for what about the times during that cycle when price falls flat or even pulls back significantly, and making sure that you aren't caught in a really bad place.
That's why I think for, I mean, it's important in every company, but it's even more important in crypto, especially when things are very optimistic. It's determining what your burn rate is going to be, and having, if you have the ability to take profits, and if it's in your token or whatever, and come up with, you know 1 to 2 years of like bare minimum burn rate, that can be, whenever you reach that threshold, it can be important to do something like that, because that's typically how long we are in a bear, and so you want to be able to kind of look at that, look at what the typical bull run length is, and then maybe kind of like look at the lower end of that to kind of try to anticipate where, when we might be shifting, and maybe even, before that point, of what the typical is, because we've talked about kind of the shortening cycle theory, and how those kind of gains are look like they may be compressing into a shorter window. So, determining, I think that understanding the cycles and where you are in the cycles is going to be critically important to a lot of Web3 startups, especially those with their own native token, because, you know, as we know as well, like understanding the tax implications of converting a token that you minted for $11, the entire supply. Whenever you go to sell that on the open market, you're going to have a gain associated with that as well. So when you do go to maybe raise funds by selling some of your own project tokens, it's important to be aware of the tax implications of that as well. So I think that burn rate is, it's always important in businesses that are early stage, but I think it's even more important in crypto because of how volatile everything is.
Totally, totally agree. Completely agree on all of that, Taylor. Um, super important. One thing on tools that I forgot to mention, I just wanted before I forget this. I do think something that in this can even, I think AI is going to allow us to mine for a lot more types of data, and also to write more complicated forecasting models. So, like, for example, I know how to go into Excel, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this do too, and to make Excel do all sorts of different things that are really cool. But my knowledge is limited to a certain extent. And without going and hiring somebody who like knows everything about Excel, there's a certain limitation there. But I would suspect that with things like AI, we're going to be able to, type in, hey, I want to make Excel do this. Tell me what I need to write for that formula or for whatever to do that. And so I think we're going to be able to get a lot more creative. So I just think that's exciting.
Yeah, I also think that like we're going to be able to leverage AI to say, "Hey, look at this data set. Is there anything interesting that, you think tells a story about the data?" And I think that leveraging AI to analyze things quickly and see if it can recognize any patterns or anything that, is compelling. I think that stuff like that is going to be interesting. And I know I saw a video recently about how, I think it was from Sam Altman, talking about how, people are trying to figure out whether they want AI to be a clone of them, or kind of like a senior level person that just, maybe will challenge you in certain ways. And I think that for the finance role, you don't necessarily want a clone of yourself, because you want it to be able to look at things with a kind of clear perspective without the kind of biases that we have inherently. And I think that having that kind of like senior management archetyped, within AI, that's willing to challenge you and maybe willing to kind of point you in the direction of something that it finds compelling, is going to be, I think, interesting as well. I think we're in a very kind of pivotal period here with the advent of all this stuff, because it's allowing for a lot of different possibilities that I think were harder to see previously.
Absolutely. I totally agree. And this goes to like the statistical approaches that I have here. And, depending on how complex a forecast gets, there's all sorts of different statistical approaches that we can use to, determine what's a reasonable growth rate, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure with, all the different types of business models in crypto, when we're looking at, wallets and active users and all just the many different types of metrics that can be used for KPIs, depending on the business model. Um, Statistics can be important, but I also think that you're right, Taylor. Being able to go in and have AI look at data sets is going to start to give us an even better, even more insight into what reasonable rates, growth rates, attrition rates, whatever they are, may be. So that's super, super exciting. Um, so thinking about, there's a few more things here we have on building the forecast. One thing that's really important, I think, is reducing the vulnerability to human error. So building it in a way that is as low touch as possible. So, for example, if the subledger or the other data cleansing tool or data manipulation tools, whatever we're using to bridge data into whatever the top level tool is, whether it's Excel or something else, having as little human error as possible, or vulnerability to that. So as low touch, as few people entering numbers as possible. I Every time I build something like this, I always am challenging myself, like, what is the least amount of typing that anybody would have to do to keep this up to date? Because that's where all of a sudden, somebody fat fingers something and nobody catches it and everything's off, and those things can spin up pretty high before somebody goes, oh wait, this doesn't make any sense. And that's that's something that we have to be really, from a risk management perspective, I think we have to be really careful about, and protecting the sheets and making sure they can't be manipulated without thinking about it, because a lot of times it's just mistakes. It's not people trying to do something wrong. It's just, somebody presses delete all of a sudden and a formula gets deleted, or, enters something incorrectly. So we have to continue to just be as focused as possible on as low touch as we can get.
Mhm. Agreed.
And that goes along too with reconciliations and tools to audit the model. So any kind of like, and we probably all do this as people with accounting backgrounds, but those other little side calcs that we always have that say, okay, well, this is a reconciliation, so now we know that things are coming out. And if not, we're like, okay, there's something wrong here and it has to be fixed because the model isn't correct, the forecast isn't correct. So any of those types of things that can be created are really important. um, and then that that to me is the building, and then it gets fun going into the different variations of how we can visualize it. And Taylor, like you were talking about, I being able to create visuals from forecast and accounting data for people who don't want to look at the numbers
Mhm.
in the way that we look at them is critical, because that tells the story. And sometimes one or two charts can tell a story, and that's where we start to really move up the value chain as finance people and be able to really inject ourselves into the strategic decision making of businesses.
and it's a huge skill, right, to be able to present data in a way that's like engaging and easily digestible. Because when I in my more active time in the space, when I was doing this more often, I had CEOs that they didn't want to, like, if I showed them like a comparative like financial of like just like the P&L, versus some other time frame, they weren't interested in that. They were interested in graphs and charts and things like that that kind of told a story. But that's a skill to develop, to be able to present things in an engaging way that tell a story that is worth, you know, telling. So I think that that itself is a skill that needs to be developed as well.
Oh, I completely agree with you, and it's a skill, and it also helps us to look at the data in a different way and get out of the trees and look at the forest
Hmm.
and say, does this like make conceptual sense?
Hmm.
When I'm preparing this presentation to tell this story to the CEO, and maybe some investors, whatever, whomever that may be, and I look at this story, does this story make sense? And sometimes those visuals and creating that story start to inform us as to, well, maybe this doesn't make sense, or here are other metrics that would be really, really interesting and informative. And here's other areas that, as a finance function, we can provide real strategic value to the organization. And I really think that the role of the CFO is um, is going to continue to be more and more value added. And as businesses become more and more aware of the power of data, and businesses are a business to make money, so financial data is going to be hugely important. I think that CFOs have an amazing opportunity to really move up the value chain in the organizations and be one of the most strategic partners to the CEO of an organization.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that we talk about it a lot, but I think it's hard to overstate the value of becoming a prompt engineer as well, because you know the skills, like, it's important to understand. I think we're in a unique position because we were forced to learn the tools and actually like do them ourselves. So we understand the things that they're capable. So, specifically thinking about Excel, like Excel can do some amazing things, but if you're unaware of that because you don't have the experiential knowledge of having to go through and figure out ways that it can be used, you don't know necessarily how much you can leverage prompt engineering to, plug data into Excel maybe and get out of it, more by just kind of like guiding AI as well along the path of helping you analyze the data. And there may be kind of like pathways to just input data sets into ChatGPT or whatever model you're using and just say, hey, kind of what interesting things do you see in here? Like we were talking about before. It's like, what trends do you see? And then you can maybe manually look into it a little bit deeper on your own. But getting a starting point as well, and just becoming a prompt engineer, I think is going to be a key aspect of this as well moving forward.
Oh, I totally agree. And I think it's I think it's really important for, and you touched on it, Taylor. In the old, I've been doing this type of work for a really long time. And, when I started out in public accounting, people who were in higher level roles didn't really get into details at all. And that was kind of like, oh, that's beneath me or whatever. But things were quite static. The way people did things was the way that had been done. And there are a lot of tried and true methods. We're in a different time now where there are so many different things to think through. And I don't think that rolling up your sleeves and getting your hands dirty in the weeds with the tools and with the data, I think that's actually a really, really good thing. And I think it's going to make, as long as we all know, if are we playing in the tree or are we playing in the forest?
Hmm.
and being able to play in both of those places, uh, that's where I think we can be really, really valuable. I think that's really important.
Hmm. Yeah, of course.
So now, then this goes right into using the forecast, and it can be, when the startup is super small and just starting out, it can just be, hey, how do we make sure we have enough cash? It can be, are we making any money? That's the forecast, those are the forecasts, like what KPIs are going to tell us if we're actually going to be able to generate X amount of cash this month. But as businesses grow, and it's astonishing how quickly businesses in this particular ecosystem can grow, in a matter of 6 months, a year, a couple of years, start to get into, m- you know, many other uses of a forecast, like hiring. How many people do we need to hire? How many people can we hire? Capital needs, when are we going to need to go out and raise more capital, or when are we going to need to go out and raise some debt? Forecasting is important for, risk policy. Where are the pain points here? Like, okay, so we have these three different forecasted scenarios. And in this one forecasted scenario, though we don't think the probability is high, the risk is significant. How do we develop a risk policy to make sure that that doesn't take the company out if that were to happen? And measuring all of the different needs of the organization is, the forecast can be used in so many different ways. And this is where I think it's that education we were talking about at the beginning is really, really important, because as these businesses evolve, making sure that the people we're communicating with understand that the forecast is being used based on historical data now, and also what we see, occurring, and the different types of events that we need to forecast for, instead of that model that was used before, that was, great, it was our starting point, but that model, if it's wildly different than the forecast, the model is, there's all kinds of different things we can explore as to why is it wildly different? Should we change our business model? All those sorts of things. But it doesn't mean that we need to scrap the forecast and just use the model and live in a world that really is not grounded in data and in reality. So I think that's really important. And going back to, as we were talking about before, the financial storytelling and presentations, this is, and this, I think this is where the fun part of our jobs become, the numbers are great, but being able to really, be creative and storytell and help a company become what it has the potential of being, and being part of that is really exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Definitely. And I just wanted to highlight, Christian just dumped in a link to a tool that you can use for crypto specific stuff. It's going to be, I think, more valuable for folks that have either their own like native token or things like that. And it's obviously going to be crypto specific, but it's called Artemis. And I can just share my screen real quick, and then I'll
Oh,
give
yeah.
screen sharing just back to you real quick, Carrie. But I just wanted to highlight this because I haven't been previously aware of this, but just gives you really cool data that's plugged in, that's real time, right? That's all about whether it's daily transactions, daily active addresses, DEX trading volumes. If you're on multiple DEXs as a Web3 project, you can see which ones are most popular, and maybe how that trends over different times. So you can manage the liquidity in different in different pools across different chains. We see total value locked here and the trends on that. And so these are KPIs that didn't exist before, right? I mean, so we have fee revenue, we have fees, we have revenue, we have the price, the market cap, all these items that can be viewed in real time if you plug in just the simple contract addresses, right? And so um, we can see a lot more. We can see just from this one example that we have so much more data that we can leverage. And I mean, you know, daily active addresses and the total numbers of wallets, that's going to be huge for tracking your growth. And it may be something that, may not lead directly to revenue, but network effect and buy-in, those things are going to be important to the growth of the company as well. And so some of that stuff can be, forced by airdrops and other stuff like that. But I mean, when you are trying to track how well different initiatives are working, whether it's marketing or whatever, all this info is going to be very valuable, and it's part of the toolkit that the modern CFO in crypto is going to need to understand and leverage. So this seems like a really cool tool that Christian just dropped in there. It's called
By the way,
Artemis.xyz.
on this, Taylor, something that Artemis really touts is that their data on, at the very least, I've seen a few like articles and things like that on daily active users is the most accurate because they
Okay.
use some sort of I can't remember what their differentiator is when it comes to activity, but making the differentiation between a wallet and an actual real human being user.
So
Um,
this is people interacting with the protocol. So it seems like people that actually initiating transactions. It sounds like is the main differentiator
Yeah,
here.
basically their kind of goal is to, in this dashboard at least, because I saw a post about it and went through whatever, was like to exclude bots, to exclude, nascent wallets and other things like that.
Okay, very cool. Thanks for that awesome tool. Um, yeah, cool. Sorry, Carrie. I'll give screen sharing back. I just wanted to kind of highlight
Oh
that real quick.
no, that I'm happy that you did that because that is really a great share. I think that looks. I wrote it down. I'm like, I gotta go check this out.
I mean,
That's awesome.
they're certainly trying to do like what, like Dune and Flipside Crypto and like all these other, but like I think that the big differentiator with hopefully maybe something like this, I really don't know, is like with Dune, with Flipside, with on network, I think is the other one. They all require like some data analysts to go in and individually like add protocols and to write like tons of code. And it's just a huge step up. And if you don't have that knowledge, it's gonna be really hard. I think what they're trying to do is like a no code Dune. I think they're trying to get to that point where like
Mhm.
you can hopefully just prompt what you want from your aggregated data and you can get those sort of aspects from it. So from what I understand, that's the direction they're going to go.
Very
So,
cool. Love it.
That's super cool. That very, very cool. Um, okay, we only have a few minutes left. I'm not gonna reshare my screen. I'm just gonna go through a couple things that I think are really important. One is the forecast update schedule. So it's really, really important to have a schedule for when the forecast gets updated because you never know if you've got a forecast file sitting out there and all of a sudden people in the organization are like, oh, I'm just going to go pull up the forecast and it hasn't been updated in 6 months and they are using completely outdated forecasted data. It can be really bad. So I think forecast should, is it something you're going to do on your month end close? Or is it something you're going to do on your quarter close? When are you going to do it? But it needs to have a schedule and a quality control element. So who's allowed to update it? How do you check if any data that you're pulling in, if those, if that data is good, that it's complete, different reconciliations. So and then evaluating the forecast effectiveness. So is this really giving us the data that we need? Are these the KPIs that are important to our business? Or do we need other ones? And constantly looking at the business and saying, is this giving us what we need to be best in class, top level? And if it isn't, then how can the forecast be adjusted accordingly? So those are obviously incorporating new data and metrics and identifying new needs, but just always it's not like okay, well, an income statement's an income statement, right? It had, you're gonna, if you have a new account, you add it, but a forecast is really something that is a living, breathing thing that needs to be consistently looked at and challenged to make sure it's really informative to the business and it's strategic to the business.
Absolutely. Any thoughts from anyone else that, to add on to the subject, or any questions or comments?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Carrie. This was wonderful. I'd love to explore maybe putting together a course or something more in depth, because I see this as being a very important topic, especially to the modern day CFO. And for me, being part of a C-suite but having nothing to do with the financial side of things, I think the biggest takeaway from what you said would probably be the element of storytelling and presenting the data, because I don't see numbers, I see creative things, I see stories, I see things of that nature. So if we had a CFO who was coming to me with information, cool, the numbers make sense, we're running out of money, or we have tons of money, or this is what the future looks like, but what is the story? How was it presented? How was, I think that might be a skill set in its own, and there might be different tools that we would use for that. And I think that goes back to the running theme that we've had over the last few weeks, is being able to educate your C-suite team and and the potential investors and those that are involved, not just showing the numbers. It's like that doesn't, I'll admit, it wouldn't work for me. It would give me a general understanding to say, okay, this is where we're at, but what is the story? What is the bigger picture here, in a more detailed and better presented way. So I think just that is one element of this entire thing, but I think it's a very important element, especially when you're dealing with creative individuals who may not have a grasp on finances, or the ability to understand how businesses actually run. So if you find yourself in that position, I think that is a very big issue, like what Raymond was talking about last week and the week before, where there's just that back and forth between the CFO and the entire C-suite and investors. So yeah, definitely something I'd love to explore more.
I think it would be, I'm just putting it out there, I think it would be super worthwhile to even do a few things that are just focused on financial storytelling and how to take the accounting forecast data, all the different types of data that we understand and we look at, and really communicate that to the rest of the business and the other stakeholders. And I think it would be really cool too to get, Brandon, your input of, what are the types of things, put this in front of you. Does this make any sense? Is this important to you? Like, does this tell you anything that you're interested in knowing? That is absolutely a skill set. And I see it all the time on, higher level finance, requirements that people are looking for. Hey, you got to be able to communicate this, in a storytelling format.
It's interesting for me because it directly connects with, me being in the marketing space. Marketing, if you're not an expert marketer or somebody who's in the marketing side, it doesn't really make sense. And it's very hard to explain what marketing actually is. Advertising is really easy. It's one-to-one. You spend this much, this is the ROI expected, and this is the actual ROI that's gained. Whereas marketing might be me trying to convince a team, like, we need to spend this money, and then there's no revenue coming in, and I'm screaming from the rafters that this is working, but nobody can understand that unless I put it into, the perfect story to explain why it's working, the growth, like we were saying, what KPIs are actually important in the space. So I absolutely understand, the art of the storytelling and presenting of the data, because sometimes the numbers, most of the time in the marketing side, the numbers won't make sense until you reach a certain level. And then it's kind of from there, you're able to understand, where things make more sense on that side. So absolutely understand that.